So once you have found your seats, I would like to ask Mr. Karas to introduce us on the latest findings and the latest developments in his work.
Thank you. So I don't have anything, really prepared because we are just on our way to Bali. Bali is going to be the third of the really substantive meetings that the panel will have. And I would say that a lot of the really tough issues have been postponed to Bali. So it's not easy for me right now to say exactly where it is that we will actually come out, because those discussions just haven't happened. And just as a quick correction, there is no draft as yet. There will be a first draft after Bali, because that's when those decisions hopefully will be taken, and we in the panel secretariat will get some guidance as to exactly what direction the panel wants to go. So I thought this morning I would just start by stepping back a little bit and asking, why are we all here? Why are we trying to do this? What is it that we're trying to do? And I don't want to get too far into the statistics of what is left to be done on the poverty front. I think everybody in this Roman audience is fairly well aware of it. But just to say that this is a huge and extraordinarily challenging issue. We've achieved a lot with the MDGs. Maybe because of them, maybe in spite of them, maybe some combination. It's hard to tell. Certainly because of the efforts of hundreds of thousands of people around the world, including yourselves and some of your organizations. And I think that what we're seeing is that effort, as it currently stands, is not working fast enough, deep enough, reaching everybody that needs to be reached in a way that is satisfactory. I think the starting point of the discussions that we're having is that where we are today is just not good enough. Yes, we should be reasonably proud about what has been accomplished, but I think equally we should be really outraged at what has not been accomplished and what is left to be done. And so I think that in the panel's deliberations, there are two big strands of thought. One is that we really do need to speed up what it is that we're doing. We can't afford to, at current rates of change, it will take not decades, but centuries or millennia for some of the low-income countries to converge with the kinds of living standards that people enjoy in a country such as this. That is simply not acceptable in today's world, where it appears that we have the resources, we have the knowledge, we have the technologies, we have the wherewithal to actually speed up that process quite considerably. So I think the first challenge that we face is, how do we organize ourselves so that we can actually speed up this performance? We've seen that it can be done not just in East Asian countries. The two countries that have reduced poverty the fastest in this decade, well, since the year 2000, since 1999, neither of them are in Asia. One is Ethiopia and the other is Tajikistan. Both of them are landlocked countries. We used to say landlocked countries were doomed. There was an entire economic analysis of geography as destiny, and landlocked countries simply couldn't compete. Well, I'm sorry, it's wrong. And we have two great examples. So we have examples now of performance in every country, every type of country, about what can be done, and yet we also see in many other countries that it is not done. The second big strand, I would say, is that we can't keep doing business as usual. We have to change course. The kind of path that we're on at the moment for poverty reduction, in fact for development more broadly, is just simply not sustainable. In the conversations that we have, many people say, look, we're not just interested in ending poverty. We're also interested, in fact, we're primarily interested in building prosperity. Well, you can't actually disentangle those two things. You cannot build prosperity while leaving poverty untouched. Just way too many people get left behind in a society. Societies don't have the stability, they don't have the sense of direction. Ending poverty is critical to building prosperity. If we want to tackle environmental challenges and have environmental sustainability, we can't do that if we don't have prosperity. We're going to need to invest massive amounts in infrastructure to achieve the kinds of transformations of food, water, and energy systems that will be required for a planet which is expanding from 7 billion today to 8 billion in 2030 to 9 billion by 2050. If we're successful in building prosperity, we will have to tackle these environmental challenges, and we will need the funds that come from prosperous societies in order to be able to undertake those investments. And we won't be able to end poverty if we don't tackle environmental challenges. We know that there are 1 billion plus people who rely on ecosystems for a large fraction of their livelihood. We know that natural capital, the ability to use natural capital, is probably one of the greatest assets of poor people. And we know that under current systems, that capital is being degraded. Either it's being degraded in a physical sense, or it's being degraded because it's being taken away and captured by others so that it's no longer available for use by the poor. So these three strands of ending poverty, of building prosperity, and of sustainability, or maybe even more broadly, of preparing for the future, because we're entering into a world where there are many unknowns. We're entering into a world of a great deal of uncertainty. We have uncertainty about economic growth. We have uncertainty about the climate. We have uncertainty about social stresses and stability. Those three things really come together and have to be woven together into a single agenda. There have been people who have argued that by weaving these things together into a single agenda, you divert focus and divert resources from, and you name which of your preferred advocacy area you like. Those who are in poverty advocates worry that all the resources will be diverted into environmental sustainability and out-of-poverty reduction programs. Those who are environmental advocates worry that if you were successful in reducing poverty, it'll put more stress on the environment, more consumption, more materialism, and it makes that even worse. That is a false, a completely false dichotomy. We have to meld these together into a single agenda. In the panel's communique that it issued after Monrovia, it talked about ending poverty very explicitly. That's something that's been around for decades. There was talk about ending poverty in the first UN development decade. It started in 1960s. There was talk about ending poverty, frankly, with President Truman's speeches after the Second World War. It's been a dream for a long time. It's a dream that today is actually feasible and realistic. But it will imply an extraordinary change in how we do things. As soon as you move from saying we're going to halve poverty, which is the MDG language, to saying we're going to end poverty, you have to do things quite differently. You have to identify who are the marginalized groups, who are the groups who are not being reached with current systems, and what can be done in order to reach out and include those systems, those groups into the modern systems of the economy, of safety nets, and of their rights. Ending poverty means addressing inequality, precisely because ending poverty means you reach everyone. It's a very powerful statement about inequality of opportunity, about giving every child a fair chance in life. We know that it's not going to completely eradicate inequality. We know that there are all kinds of advantages that you get from your parents' education and status and things like that. Nevertheless, there are a number of things that can be delivered to people everywhere that provide a certain basic minimum opportunity so that they can have lives that, so that they can invest themselves in their own lives and lift themselves out of poverty. The mindset on reducing poverty has to change. It is not something that is done to poor people. It is something that enables people everywhere to be able to make a better life for them and their families. When we talk about building prosperity, you cannot build prosperity if you leave large segments of your society and your economy behind. There is no society that has built prosperity without having a central role played by women. We'd have no historical examples of where that has happened. So if we don't move hard and fast towards integrating women in all ways into a modern economy, it will be impossible to achieve the kind of prosperity that is necessary. And it's not just women, it's a variety of groups that are discriminated against for one reason or another, and a variety of people who are simply not connected to a modern economy. There are 2.5 billion people who lack access to any kind of formal financial service. They go to money lenders. They have all kinds of other ways of trying to deal with a very irregular cash flow that comes in. And in trying to deal with that, it probably costs them something like 20% of their income. Well, that's 20% increase in the real incomes of the poor that could be achieved simply by giving them access to financial services, to a checking account. That's actually quite feasible now because we know that with mobile money, it's reasonably cheap, it's very affordable, and it's, for businesses, it's profitable. This is one of the new technologies that is completely revolutionizing how we think about and deliver a range of different services for poor people. And then, as we think about preparing for the future, I think it's important not to just think about that in terms of environmental sustainability, although obviously environmental sustainability has a lot to do with it. We can't afford to have a degraded environment. We cannot afford to have global temperatures rise to, I'm not quite sure to what levels. It seems inevitable that global temperatures will be rising quite significantly above pre-industrial levels, and the latest reports that have come out from the scientific community and that have been popularized by the World Bank and by others essentially paint a scenario that say if temperatures rise by 4 degrees Celsius, it's a very unpleasant picture. And they then go on to say that, well, if basically the pledges that were made at Rio +20 are actually implemented, that's where we'll be. We will be at 4 degrees Celsius. That is not a comforting thought. So obviously that's a huge part of preparing for the future, but it's not the only part of preparing for the future. We have to think about resilient societies, and resilience is not just about preparing for natural disasters. Resilience is also about individuals having safety nets, having some kind of protection. Resilience is also about planning for the future. Many developing countries today also have issues with aging societies. Aging is no longer just a problem of rich countries. So as we look towards 2030, there are going to be a range of other issues which will be important and which will be quite critical for the sustainability of the agenda. The panel will produce a report. We're scheduled to deliver it to the Secretary General on May 30th. I think we're, on track to be able to do something like that, presuming that we get a decent amount of consensus at Bali. Big assumption, but let's keep our fingers crossed. And then the panel's work is over. That's the time when kind of I go home and everybody else gets to decide, well, what do we now do with this? And that, I think, is a question that all of you should be thinking hard about. Because the panel's report is only going to be one of a number of different submissions and contributions to the post-2015 agenda. The post-2015 agenda ultimately will be an agenda that will be determined by member states. It's an intergovernmental process. It's not a process of, accepting or rejecting the work of an independent panel. And those member states respond to pressure. And I think that, looking around, my guess is that there are a lot of pressure points right here in this room. So ultimately, you probably have more to do with what will finally get accepted and reflected in the post-2015 agenda than the panel report. So going forward, we'll have a process of about 2 years between now and 2015, where that intergovernmental process will have to run its course. My guess is that that's going to be a very intensive time for everybody in this room. And after that, the actual work begins of speeding up the task of poverty reduction and more sustainable development, and of changing course. Because if we don't do both, if we don't speed up and if we don't change course, I don't think we will be in a very attractive world by 2030. Thank you very much. Do you want me to stay here?
Thank you. Thanks, Homi. That was very, very interesting, and I must say, very reassuring to hear from you that people here would have a major say. I'm glad you're saying that. At least you believe that. We certainly believe that, and we need to work for that. The way we've designed this session is in broadly 3 parts now. You've heard now Homi share his thoughts, stimulating ideas. So we just wanted to take maybe 2 or 3 questions, more of clarification. Then we are going to move on to a conversation with 2 of our comrades, co-travelers, Homi, and I'll introduce them a little later, for around half an hour. And the last half an hour, we would have a broader conversation amongst all of us with Homi. So if that's all right, I'm going to take 3 questions. Okay, let me just... Oh, that's 1, 2... Joanna, you've been... I should do this. 3, yeah. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your remarks this morning. My name is Michael Swidell. I'm with GCAP, Global Call to Action Against Poverty. I'm going to try and package 3 very short questions into one. The first is, you mentioned ending poverty. Can we assume that that is the goal now that that will come out of the high-level panel report, that ending poverty will be it, as opposed to any other reduction? 2, is there a time frame which is pretty much assumed now? I think you mentioned 2030, but is that a given, or is that still something under discussion? And 3, you mentioned that you're going to start your drafting after Bali. We hear there are discussions, well, a high-level panel-supported meeting, or a secretariat-supported meeting in Mexico in May. Or, sorry, is it April or May? In April. And wondering to what extent that will also feed into the process. Thank you.
Thanks. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Birgit Bain, Welthungerhilfe and Alliance 2015. I'm here. Thank you very much. I have 3 procedural questions, actually, and it's linking a little bit to what was just said. One is actually, what's the scenario and the thinking after the high-level panel has finished its work? I know there is the open working group, but I mean, we have heard a lot yesterday of having the one integrated agenda, bringing the 2 processes together. So what is the thinking actually? Where are the institutional preparations for actually making that happen? 1. Number 2, you were talking about the report of the high-level panel, and after Bali, you think there will be a first draft and consensus. So looking back at all the inclusiveness and participation, civil society consultations, etc., will that report be available to us? Will it be on the net somewhere? Second question. And 3rd, really out of interest, with that plethora of consultations that has taken place with civil society, what are actually the criteria for deciding what is taking on board and what isn't, thinking of the thematic consultations, the regional ones, etc.? Thank you.
Yeah, please. I wonder if you also going to have 3 questions.
Well, let me think. I can probably unpack it into 3 questions. Good morning. I'm Bettina Prato from IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. The questions are for clarification, really. You spoke about 3 parts of a single agenda, and these are ending poverty, building prosperity, and preparing for the future, or sustainable, looking after sustainability. Now, I'm very interested in the notion of prosperity, because I think you don't necessarily mean by that just economic growth, because you use the term prosperity advisedly. So I wonder if you could say a couple of words about how the panel is actually thinking about what sort of model of prosperity to propose? Is there a discussion about sort of moving from perhaps a growth-focused understanding of prosperity towards a different understanding of it? And the other question is really very simple, and that's about the content of the report. It is, to what extent does the report already, or do you think that the report will get into proposals of specific goals, of implementation strategies, etc., versus coming up with a broader agenda or a vision type of input? Thank you.
Thanks, Homi.
Okay, thank you. Ending poverty is one of the goals of that the panel has set itself. It's part of the panel's vision. It's in the Monrovia communique, but it's not the only part. As I said, there are strands that are intertwined, and I think the panel's view is that one cannot end poverty without also taking on board these other issues. So in the vision of the panel, in the Monrovia communique, you will see ending poverty, having in place the building blocks for prosperity, and preparing for the future, or putting all of this in the context of sustainable development. The time frame, I think I should say something about, what do we mean by end? It's some people have said, look, it's ending. This is not like smallpox. It's not that you go out and you look for, that last person and make sure that it never, arrives again. I think what we really mean by ending poverty is that poverty as we know it today, which is it's a large political, moral issue, basically disappears. It becomes small enough that it becomes something that every individual country will handle by itself, where it no longer needs a global coalition and a global movement in order to be able to, achieve the job. It's not to say that there won't be some poor people elsewhere, and particularly it's important to understand that the hope is that the level of ambition will be consistently raised. So this is not just about ending poverty at $1.25 or $2 a day or some international line. This is really about pushing all countries to try to think about what's an appropriate poverty line for them, and to try to really put in place policies, strategies, and actions to essentially eradicate it within a reasonable time frame. Now, what is a reasonable time frame? We're settling on a time frame of around 2030, largely as a political time frame, meaning that's a time frame which is long enough that it permits one to think about doing things differently, but short enough that it still conveys the sense of urgency which I think we need in order to address these problems, and can link into short-run monitoring and accountability mechanisms, including things like annual budgets. So if you were to push this out to, let's say, 50 years, it becomes very difficult to bring it back to a budget. But over a time frame like 2030, it becomes much easier. Finally, the Mexico meeting in April, is a consultation meeting. We've had a whole series of regional consultation meetings, and this will be the second. There was one in Latin America in March, but this one I think will try to involve many more civil society organizations as well. It's slightly late in the process, but frankly, better late than never. There was a question on the Open Working Group and how these processes will come together. Assistant Secretary General Shamshad Akhtar is right in front of me, and she is much better placed to answer that question than I am, so I will defer to her. When will the report be published, etc.? That is a decision for the Secretary General to make, not for the panel to make. Our task is to advise the Secretary General, and a report will be delivered to the Secretary General. What he does with it is then his prerogative. How do the consultations get taken on board? I think in the same way as, everything else. Look, at the end of the day, the panel's report is a report of the panel. It's the judgments of panel members. Now, what many panel members have said is that they will endeavor to do their best to make sure that the report reflects the views of poor people who, in their minds, were not sufficiently consulted during the MDG process. So I think that the process of consultations that panel members have been doing independently and regionally with the UN, sometimes, just in terms of their own interactions, has basically been to help them develop their views, which they bring independently to the panel discussions and hence into the report. So it's a matter of just informing the panel, but at the end of the day, the views will be the views of the panel as a whole and as a consensus body. From IFAD, I didn't realize IFAD had transformed itself into a civil society organization. That really came as a surprise to me. Look, I think everybody is aware of the big discussions now going on about the difference between economic growth and prosperity or well-being. I think it's it's the nature of that difference really depends on what income level you're at, what kind of country you're at. It depends a lot on individual societies, but certainly prosperity also includes a whole range of issues like access to justice, like the absence of violence, like a whole range of other things that are typically not measured in economic growth. So there's been plenty of research, there's plenty of movement in terms of new statistical systems to try to encourage different ways of measuring well-being or prosperity. My guess is that every country is going to experiment with its own views and vision. We're certainly not trying to develop at this point a global standard for what prosperity actually means. And then the broad issue of exactly what the panel report will contain. Is it just a narrative? Is there also going to be goals? Is it going to be means of implementation, etc.? I'll tell you after Bali.
Okay. So thanks, Homi. I'm going to welcome you to take a seat. While you were speaking, you talked of the need for extraordinary changes. And you also did talk of your analysis of how you're looking at the world. And to to quite an extent, the conversations that I've heard since yesterday, there would be a reasonable overlap in terms of how we are analyzing the issues. I think a lot of emphasis now needs to go in terms of the discussion on how to do it. That's what needs further nuancing, and maybe that's where our inputs would be very, very crucial. And I'm sure that two of our co-travelers are going to probe and have a discussion with you around this. So I'm delighted to invite Anita Nair from Dawn. As people would know, Dawn is a development alternatives women for a new era organization, and then it's a third world feminist network. So welcome, Anita. And I'm also equally delighted to invite Paul Quintos from IBON. This is an NGO based in the Philippines, which works with social movements throughout the global south. So over to you, Anita.
Oh, I see. I was moved. Sure. Okay, I'll move this so I can see you a bit better. Okay, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to have you with us after a day of intense discussions yesterday with all of us that will continue. So I wanted to pick up on your emphasis of poverty eradication, and during the post-2015 consultations and during the open working group on SDGs, which started last week, we heard almost all states speak to poverty eradication. But we heard two different narratives of how to approach that. And a number of states spoke and articulated very clear proposals of the structural transformations that are needed of the global financial and economic architecture, that actually without which we will not be able to achieve sustainable development and poverty eradication. And on the other hand, we heard some states claim that, we're well on our way to achieving the MDGs, and we can sort of articulate an MDG plus agenda, focus on the bottom billion, and include absolute goals, and the articulation was about eradicating extreme poverty. So I'm just wondering in which direction your conversations are going in the high-level panel, and how do you intend to reflect these different narratives to actually achieving that goal?
I've heard people say these are two quite different narratives, and I'm actually just not convinced they are. There is every country has their own poverty line. The $1.25 a day is, it's a bit of an artifact which we have developed to try to have a little bit of sense of comparability across countries. But at the end of the day, the action on ending poverty is actually a national action. And countries have and should have their own poverty lines and should be really pushing very hard to be trying to end poverty based on their poverty lines. Now, I think that there have been some cases where countries have had poverty lines which are so low that they don't meet even a bare minimum, what I would call a bare minimum global standard. And one of the things that the global community can do is to encourage those countries to, at a minimum, raise their sights and say, we in the global community will try to mobilize the resources, mobilize the technology, and help you so that you will be able to eradicate poverty at that higher global floor level, even if you can't do it using your own resources. So I think we have to think about this as being much more, where can the global community help? And from a financial perspective, it may be that the global community helps much more in countries that can't afford to do it themselves. But we also know that there are lots of countries that can afford to do it themselves, but don't always have the tools, the strategies, the shared experiences. So, take for example a country like Brazil. So about, something like a month ago, President Dilma Rousseff said, Brazil is on the verge of eradicating extreme poverty. They've done it not by resource transfers from the rest of the world, but they've done it with an integrated program, what they call the Zero Hunger program, which has microcredit, it has land reform, it has watershed management, it has entrepreneurship, and it has social assistance programs and conditional cash transfer programs. So there are lots of dimensions to it. It's a program that has now reached something over 20, maybe 22 million families, something like that. It's the kind of experience, I think, which is being shared more broadly about what works. India is rolling out a national identification scheme, which is being used for targeted poverty programs. Those kinds of approaches, I think, will be shared much more broadly, and that's something for all kinds of countries. It's going to be something that middle-income countries will pay attention to. It's going to be something that low-income countries will pay attention to. So I think we have to, unpick a little bit this notion that it's, just to focus on extreme poverty, meaning less than $1.25, versus a focus on other kinds of poverty. I don't see that. Poverty is something which is, really embedded in most developing countries. And it's not a static group. It's not just one group of people. Poverty is actually quite dynamic. Even though the numbers might be the same, we might say there's 1 billion poor people today and 1 billion poor people next year. It's not the same billion. In fact, probably at least 30% from year to year is different. So the number of people who go in and out of poverty is actually much larger than the number of people who are just, in any given year, below $1.25. We want to be reaching all of those people.
I guess the question was more about, yes, the different narratives are more around whether poverty reduction can actually be achieved unless you actually transform the systems that have created the inequality and poverty that we're living with. While poverty may have reduced in India, the rural poverty is actually on the increase. Women in poverty are on the increase. Inequalities have deepened, and the structural causes for that are multiple. I mean, let's just take one. There's an investment crisis right now, where countries are being sued by corporations under the rules of bilateral investment treaties. So, these are investment treaties that they've signed to and are unable to get out of, and are being sued by corporations, paying hundreds of billions of dollars in legal fees and costs, in addition to their debt repayments. So when you have this kind of constraints on policy space of governments to actually implement the programs and policies you're speaking of to actually eradicate poverty, I mean, how do you actually address these crippling conditions, structural factors in the conversations and in your report?
So I think that the idea that one needs to have deep and systematic structural transformation is one that is, broadly recognized, and in my mind, I would put that under this heading of, having in place the building blocks for sustained prosperity. I mean, that is actually what we mean by that. It's undertaking those structural transformations that will allow a country to become prosperous. Now, can they do it or not? Of course, we have examples of, the limitations of this kind of policy space. I am not sure I would fully agree with you that it is hundreds of billions of dollars, nor would I fully agree with you that it is critical to achieving what we want to achieve. And I think that there are many countries that have actually been able to achieve very significant poverty reduction in the current global context. Now, could it be done faster? Maybe. You know, will we see changes in some of those things? Maybe. Certainly, I think the panel will have a discussion of, you know, several of these big issues. Just take the issues of finance as one example. Dealing with corruption is a two-way thing. Illicit capital flows from developing countries to advanced countries. Repatriation of stolen assets. We know that there are a range of these kinds of issues, and they will be discussed. Whether one can, you know, make a hard recommendation about what to do about it or not, I'll, you know, tell you later. But I think at a minimum, there will be a discussion of those issues, and you know, panel members will be making a judgment as to you know, how far they can take this. Certainly in, you know, selected individual countries, there's been some movement on some of these things. But, you know, movements and agreements don't always translate into practice, and the OECD has had a convention on bribery, which is not being satisfactorily implemented by the majority of their members by their own assessment. So implementation is also an important part of that story.
Yeah. Well, actually, my question relates directly with that also, because one of the major criticisms of the MDGs is that it placed the burden of achievement primarily on developing countries without sufficiently or adequately acknowledging the role of the international system, and in particular, how many international policies and structures are actually undermining or preventing the achievement of the MDGs and sustainable development in poor countries. So you mentioned, for instance, trade agreements, but there's also the role of financial speculation in, you know, driving food price inflation. The intellectual property rights regime, which prevents fostering industrial development in many underdeveloped countries, as well as adoption or dissemination of low-carbon alternatives and so on. So although this is probably going to be discussed in Bali in terms of the global partnerships and means of implementation, right. but because I won't be in Bali, so we would really appreciate if you know, you can share how the high-level panel will probably address these systemic issues that are really, you know, have a major implications in terms of achieving sustainable development.
My sense is that the panel is going to try to look at those issues and think about where they feel there is currently enough political momentum to be able to make a difference. You know, we could have yet another call for completion of the Doha round of trade talks. Would that make a difference? I must say I'm personally skeptical. You know, those trade talks are not moving forward for quite specific reasons, and having the panel come out and say, you know, we'd like you to reach a completion is unlikely to be more powerful than having the G20 make that statement. So the G20 has made that statement now at least 4 times that I can remember, and nothing much seems to have happened. So, you know, I think that the panel wants to be practical about this and think about, you know, in which of these areas does it feel that there is now scope for movement? And I think in some areas there is some scope for movement.
Which areas?
Amongst those range of areas that we're talking about, but we will talk about finance, we'll talk about technology transfer, we'll talk about migration, we'll talk about capacity building, we'll talk about data for development and transparency, we'll talk about a whole range of things.
I have another question. In your input earlier, you mentioned the need to go beyond business as usual. And that's a message that we keep hearing. Of course, from civil society, that's not new, but even from BUN officials and government officials, we keep hearing that nowadays. And yet, when we talk to governments, there's a chorus among governments of emphasizing the role of the private sector, of finance coming from private sector, relying on private sector initiative to drive innovation for sustainable development, and so on. No? And yet, it's precisely the multiple crises that we're confronting, whether it's the climate crisis, the food crisis, jobs crisis, rising inequality, all point to or demonstrate the dangers or perils of over-reliance on the private sector. And in fact, when we're talking to governments and we're pushing for strengthened regulations, strengthening of rights, greater public sector role in provisioning of basic goods and services, redistributive policies, asset reforms. Often the response is, well, this is going to scare away private investments and private sector initiative, and therefore, let's be cautious or let's not avoid that. So in short, there seems to be rhetoric or lip service around going beyond business as usual. But in terms of actual policies that are being considered on the table, it's very much business as usual. So I don't know how does the high-level panel report or the high-level panel members see a way out of this conundrum, of this contradiction?
I don't think it's business as usual, and for the following reasons. First of all, I think that the private sector itself, at least the more responsible elements of the private sector, are realizing that short-term profit maximization is not the basis for a long-term sustainable business. And so there is a momentum that is growing for actually assessing the total impact of the footprint of a company, including the social impact and including the environmental impact as well as the financial impact, and using that kind of measurement and metric as part and parcel of their policy dialogue. That's something which is actually quite new. And the idea has to be that the incentives of the private sector have to be more closely aligned with what's required for sustainable development. That's the change in business as usual. It's changing the incentives. That does mean changing the regulatory environment. So I'm surprised to hear you say that people aren't thinking about changing the regulatory environment. I suspect that actually they are, and the intention, I think, has to be to align all these groups together, because the scale and magnitude of the changes that we are envisaging vastly outweighs the possibility for any one group to do it by themselves. Governments simply cannot do it. The private sector on its own cannot do it. Civil society on its own cannot do it. So, the change that I envisage is one where the incentives of various actors become more closely aligned through regulation, pricing, branding, reputation. All of those things form part and parcel of the long-term sustainability of a business. Every private sector company is not going to instantly adopt this, but there are quite a few, especially amongst the major multinational corporations, that are actually doing this. So I think that that will be something quite new and quite different. And then, of course, the real change in business as usual is about technologies. It's about technologies and business models. Because we're not talking about, we're actually talking about speeding up the assimilation and adoption of new technologies in the developing world through a range of different actions, and those actions include paying much more attention to their scientific and technical capabilities domestically. We've focused a lot on basic education in many developing countries. Basic education is a prerequisite, but it is not going to be sufficient to build prosperity.
And just to deepen the question a bit, yes, greening the technologies and changing the practices of some of these corporations and private sector is needed. But the question is more around what are the dangers of having them involved in financing the development agenda. So in Rio 20, we saw a lot of emphasis on public-private partnerships as complete reliance on them for financing the outcomes of this conference. And now we're seeing in the Bali high-level panel the focus again on partnerships. And in bringing the private sector into the UN when states are not meeting their commitments to finance, it creates a kind of crisis of multilateralism. I mean, is the UN a multilateral process, or are we inviting the private sector, the corporate sector, to finance this agenda? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this, and what are the conversations like in the high-level panel to deal with this?
I mean, I think that, when we talk about development, and one of the most transformative things in development is actually the creation of jobs. I mean, that creation of jobs is a private sector activity. So I think that the demonization of the private sector as not being an actor that contributes to development is, something that has to change. The private sector, is and always has been one of the principal drivers of development. And governments can't create money. So the only way in which governments would be able to finance some of these investments would be through, horrendous rates of taxation. It's, in my mind, it's completely infeasible. When we talk about the incremental investment needs in developing countries, we're talking about orders of magnitude, incremental amounts of over $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year is not going to come from taxes. It's not going to come from ODA. That kind of money is only going to come from, the big, deep pockets of long-term finance, which are currently held in pension funds, in sovereign wealth funds, in private sector bond markets. So, if you're interested in long-term finance for development, you can't just say, well, these are the responsibilities and commitments of member states. Member states don't have, infinite resources.
I was told we only have one more question. I wanted to follow up on that because, during the financial crisis, a lot of money was able to be mobilized for bailing out the banks. But anyway,
yeah.
For my final question, this is more of a process question. Because after these consultations, many of us in civil society are wondering what's going to happen to our recommendations. Once it goes to the intergovernmental process, what would then be the role of civil society? For sure, people are saying, there's going to be openness, transparency, and then access to information of civil society, and then participation. But many of us are actually would want more than simply participation of, inputting 2 minutes in the discussion of open working group, but more of a co-determination, which means actual full and effective participation of civil society in setting whether these are the SDGs or how the implementation of the development framework would be. I was wondering if, what would be, what's the inclination of the high-level panel on this issue.
I mean, I think that the view is that ultimately the action happens in countries. Happens at the national government level, it happens at the subnational level, happens in cities, happens in local authorities and communities. That's really where the big discussion with civil society has to take place, and where, at least in my view, the impact and influence of civil society is greatest. The rest of the discussion is a discussion of how does the international community organize itself? And that means, development agencies, it means a range of other bodies. Well, there's also a role for civil society there, because civil society has also organized itself internationally. Mm-hmm. But most of those bodies are driven by their own, they each have their own governance processes. Some are UN driven, some are not. Most of them are member state organizations, and so the influence points comes through influencing member states. So I think that the interaction of civil society really happens much more through those member states. But let me be very clear about one thing. I don't see the post-2015 agenda as being a universal recipe for development everywhere. The post-2015 agenda is an agenda of how the international community can best organize itself to support national development processes. And those national development processes will be varied, they will be context dependent, they will depend on individual circumstances, there'll be a whole range of different things. On some of those things, the international community will be able to help, and on some of those things, it will not.
Thank you very much to Anita and Paul, first of all, for the tough questions, especially on the structural causes, systemic issues, and also what lies at the root of the problems of poverty. Thank you, Homi, for your very thorough answers. We would like to now widen out the conversation and invite questions from the floor. I would suggest we take them in patches of 3. That's 3 questions, 1 per person, not 3 per person. And I would start on this side. 1, 2, and at the back, number 3. Please.
We weren't but it'll come from the floor.
Okay, thank you. I will speak in French. Then, maybe you need your casque. Ah, ok. Merci. Je suis très heureux de voir que vous parlez français. La première chose que je voudrais souligner, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, c'est la journée internationale pour l'élimination de toutes les formes de discrimination. Donc, je suis très heureux même que ce soit parfait de parler français pour exprimer aussi une différence, mais aussi heureux que vous ayez mentionné un peu, c'est très aussi dans vos paroles. Mais vous avez insisté tout à l'heure sur l'évocation des questions de migration dans la prochaine rencontre de Bali. Et nous serons intéressés de savoir, en fait, justement, comment vous abordez les questions de migration dans, justement, l'agenda post-2015. Quand on sait que, pour l'atteinte des OMD, les migrants ont beaucoup contribué à travers leur transfert de fonds. On a remarqué que dans beaucoup de pays, les familles qui sont passées juste au-dessus du seuil de pauvreté, c'est les familles qui recevaient justement les transferts de fonds des migrants qui sont installés un peu partout dans le monde, certes. On a remarqué aussi que la plupart des migrants se trouvent pas forcément au nord, mais se trouvent au sud-sud. C'est surtout le sud qui apporte beaucoup plus de fonds pour justement lutter contre la pauvreté. Mais jusqu'à maintenant, on n'arrive pas à trouver un cadre légal, un cadre de dialogue international sur les questions de migration pour renforcer l'impact de la migration. sur le développement, malgré tous les efforts des Nations Unies. Donc vous, en tant que panel de haut niveau, quels sont les efforts que vous voulez faire en ce sens? Je vous remercie. Samir, je me nomme Samir Abi, je viens de la Vision Solidaire Togo.
The next one was the gentleman with the red lanyard and the glasses and the grey. Yes, you.
Surprise. Yes, I was waiting for this. In fact, sorry, the panel coordination was not so good. Mr. Homi was talking to the panel people, and I was looking all over. Some people were sleepy. So maybe next time we need more attention, you know. I missed a lot of things that you said, and because the sound was not so loud and the communication was not so maybe good. The other point is ending poverty. We talk about ending poverty. I don't agree with the term ending, because we never end poverty. As we never get to the end for anything, we cannot end poverty. As much as you have wars, as much as you have corruption, as much as you have occupation, as much as you have lack of morality in general, you'll never end poverty. So I think we here and the United Nations panel or group or whatever think about this term, ending poverty, to be changed. Maybe eliminating, maybe reducing, maybe fighting, but not ending, because it is not a practical term to be used. Number two, I think you, sir, mentioned about or talked about addressing inequality and as related to poverty. This is excellent, but also inequality is related or junked with, of course, environmental sustainability and many other things. But I talk about racism and discrimination. The Aboriginal people are poor wherever they were. In the United States, in Canada, in Australia, they are poor. Why? We have to ask this question. The Aboriginals are absolutely poor. The people of minorities, more or less, are poor. You have, in so many societies, very small fraction of societies are rich, who are mostly corrupted. We talk about developing countries, of course, yeah? And we have the majority of people who are poor, and because they are marginalized in terms of everything. And here we talk about democracy and good governance. We have no democracy, we have no good governance. And of course, very important factor to fight poverty here is education. The United Nations has to pay more attention, and of course, national and international NGOs, governments also, they have to pay more attention for education. I think when the education gets better to a higher level, the poverty is reducing automatically. And of course, this is related to many other issues like health, like food security, like environmental sustainability, and many other things. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Sorry for interrupting. I have to apologize for two things. One is my lack of ability to describe people. I was actually pointing at the gentleman behind you, so I would like to take you next. And the second is for forgetting to mention that you would please kindly introduce yourself before you start with your short intervention. Try to keep it to the point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Shopon. I am from Bangladesh.
Sorry, okay, before this starts to go completely different than intended, please, the gentleman who was, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
My name is Piet Eyben. I'm from the EMDA, European Development Agency, based in Luxembourg and Netherlands. You mentioned the forming of association of NGOs to get a stronger voice. In Europe, we have these platforms, as well national in the member states, as well on European level, like Concord. Also, we see, especially in ASEAN, these developments also in the developing countries. Like in the Philippines, you have Code NGO, which forms already this situation. So my question to you is, when we form or we associate the North and the South in the associations of NGOs, what level of consultation we can expect from the side of the UN?
Thanks a lot. And the third person that had raised the hand initially was the gentleman who's standing up now. Thank you, that's an effective way.
Hello, Michael Bunte from Helpage, Germany. In your presentation you mentioned aging as an important factor. Thank you very much for doing so, because this is an issue which is normally overlooked in many of our discussions. And we see it as a mega trend for this century, really, which will change the social architecture and which will affect most of the areas we are discussing about in the frame of a new international framework. I would like to know how the high-level panel is perceiving aging, how important they're looking at this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's pass back to Homi maybe to address this quite broad range of questions from migration to aging quickly, and then we're going to proceed to the other side of the room.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're having this conversation before the panel has actually met to discuss these issues. So all I can really say at this point is that this is something which is on the agenda, that's certainly of concern. There was a consultation focus meeting in I think in Copenhagen earlier this year on migration. Where was the migration? Stockholm? Stockholm. I wasn't there, but so it's it's very much on the agenda. Some of the issues in terms of bringing down the cost of remittances through greater competition, I think, is very much on the forefront of people's minds, because it's very closely connected with the issue of greater access to greater financial inclusion. We know that once people have access to mobile money, the unit costs of sending remittances falls dramatically, and that is clearly a process which can bring very substantial benefits directly to poor families. The point on ending poverty is, I was trying to explain before, I understand that poverty as such will never be ended, that there will always be people who are poor relative to others in society, and so one can continuously, hopefully, raise the level of ambition in terms of bringing up living standards. But I think there are two things that are important here. The first thing is that, in a world like today's, there should not be people who live below a certain threshold level of income. We are a rich enough global society to be able to avoid that. There should not be people going to bed hungry. There should not be children who are not getting vaccinations, not going to school because of income reasons. There should not be young people who are illiterate, who don't have an ability to become engaged and responsive and contributing citizens. So, all of those things are part of this broad notion of poverty that we have set ourselves, and I don't think that it is overly ambitious to say that we should end it. Ending it means setting a target with a target level of 0. It's an important target. And what it means is that once you start to say 0, then identify much more precisely who is it that you're trying to reach, and develop different plans and strategies for it. Once you start to do that, then you will start to, for example, take a country like Bangladesh and say, what would it mean if you want to say, we want to literally reach universal learning for all children. It means very specific strategies for slum dwellers, very specific strategies for people from whose families you have child labor, very specific strategies for people in remote areas like the Chittagong Hill Tracts. So you start to actually, unpack and say, well, these are the people who are currently not benefiting from the system, and this is what we need to do in order to reach them. So the value of saying end and get to 0 is precisely that it forces you to develop strategies for every single group that is currently being missed out. There was a question about future consultations with the UN. I am not part of the UN, so I'm not really, Shamshad will speak to that. And then finally on aging, I think the panel has actually looked quite seriously at demographic trends as a whole. Demographic trends are actually very powerful factors in shaping what will happen in the post-2015 world. We've already reached a point where the number of children in the world has stabilized. There are now 2 billion children. It's no longer increasing. That means it's much easier to change focus to quality rather than to quantity. We're not talking about expanding facilities any longer. We're really talking about improving quality of delivery of services. The youth bulge, by and large, in most places, the youth bulge has passed through and is now starting to mature. The one exception is in sub-Saharan Africa, where the youth bulge is just starting to really hit. And then, of course, you have aging, all those places where, as I said, the youth bulge has passed through. Lots of people have argued that a considerable part of Asian success was because of taking advantage of the entry of young people into the labor force. That's now maturing, and many of those societies are starting to age. When you look at 2030, which is not that far away, you suddenly start to see a real change in the nature of dependency from child dependency to aging dependency, just in terms of which groups societies will need to pay attention to and take care of.
Thank you very much. We are a little bit running out of time now, so I will have to ask the questionnaires and the answers to be really brief and to the point. I'm going to take 3 more questions now, but I'm sure Homi will be around afterwards in the break for further questions, and maybe also Shamshad for those ones that are more related to your area. I take women. Okay, then I take you. You, and well, I think it's fair to go on this side for now, and you in the middle with the black. Yeah. Okay. Does everybody know who I pointed to? It was Pat and the lady with the curly hair and the lady with the black hair. Good.
Thank you. Pat Lerner from Greenpeace International. Thank you, Homi. I have more of a political question about all of this. We've seen high-level panels meet. We've seen reports before. And unfortunately, many of them have never gone anywhere. They've had nice visions. They've even had some good recommendations. But if they're not tied into political processes, then there's a lot of frustration. So we've got this whole process, multiple processes, lots of consultations, which are creating expectations of what's going to come out on the other end. And this is my concern, because fundamentally, the UN hasn't changed. The member state views haven't changed. So my question to you is, your high-level panel, how is it going to be different? Do you have political commitments from the individuals that they will continue? You go back to Brookings, can write a book and all of this, but your panel members who are there in their personal capacity, is there anything you can get from them that they will continue to push their governments to not be obstructionist and move the agenda forward?
Yes, my name is Emilia Reyes. I come from Mexico, from an NGO called Gender Equity. And in regard to the inclusion of women to achieve prosperity, I wanted to ask in what way is the panel addressing, under the framework of human rights, those structural matters related to gender inequalities, such as the domestic and care non-paid work women perform, access to land and property and social protection. And how is the panel thinking to go beyond an instrumental approach in regards to women as in benefit of an economic development, since sexual and reproductive rights have been negotiated in the sustainable agenda, such as what happened in Rio Plus 20?
My name is Thea Sharrock. I'm from the Participate Initiative. As outlined in the discussion so far, the landscape of poverty is increasingly characterized by conflict, crisis, uncertainty. In the research from Participate so far, this is increasing ongoing uncertainty in the lives of people living in poverty, and in turn, the impossible choices and trade-offs in relation to their own development pathways. The recommendation that's concretely coming out of this work is to ensure the framework responds to this, specifically in relation to development processes and accountability mechanisms that ensure agile learning systems and feedback loops in place at the local, national and global levels, and ensuring that citizen-led monitoring, citizen-led participation is central to this for ensuring local realities drive development. And I'm wondering what the panel is thinking about concretely in relation to this context, and ensuring that it's reflecting all of those levels that need to be taken into account.
Thanks a lot for the question. So this is about the life after the high-level panel, as well as implementation and gender and inequalities. And I would like to throw in an additional question from Twitter that came in regarding the national civil society deliberations that Beyond 2015 has been conducting. The first report is in, and they prioritize human rights and inequalities, maybe adding to the question before. And the question is how the high-level panel would be treating human rights and inequalities as well. So if I can ask you for brief comments. Thank you.
So on the first question about the political process, you know, as I look at the panel members, they've been quite carefully chosen. So the panel has a very balanced geographic representation. It's very balanced in terms of gender. I think it's the first UN panel which is 50-50 in terms of its gender composition. It does have people from the private sector who are on it. I would imagine that that wasn't coincidental. So I imagine that some of these people have been chosen precisely because of the political judgments that they bring to the table. So, you know, they're there in their personal independent capacities, but they're not just a random bunch of smart people who have thought about development. So I'm not quite sure what, you know, what more I can say on that. There are no commitments on anything. There's no the sort of the path after delivery of the report. The nature of the personal engagement of panel members, etc., is something that has to be sorted out. But that's really going to be a you know, judgment of the Secretary General, what he would ask panel members to do in the future. And as far as I know, that conversation has not been had as yet. On the issue on women, I think that there was a very useful and very hopeful agreement at the United Nations on the Committee on the Status of Women that laid out a set of agreements that the panel can build on, because these have now been endorsed by member countries, and they cover a range of issues, including issues like access to sexual and reproductive health services. So I think that as far as they can, the panel will look to try to build on existing political agreements and momentum, and then think about the ways in which those can be both incorporated into an agenda and actually implemented in a meaningful way. In terms of the the structures to try to get more feedback loops, etc., one of the big problems with the way in which we do development right now is just simply data and information. And the problem is lack thereof. The actual data that we are using is really awful. It's in a pitiful state. And for all these numbers that people throw around, the level of confidence in those numbers is small. And I think that if one is going to be serious about a post-2015 agenda, then one needs to get much, much more serious about timely and accurate and disaggregated data. Because if we don't have timely and accurate and disaggregated data, then a lot of what I have just been talking about is not going to happen. We will not be able to identify, the groups that are being left behind if we have no metrics about who is being left behind. And it's not much use having those metrics 5 or 6 years afterwards. We have to have it in real time. You can't have feedback loops if you don't have more, timely data. So I mean, as I go into this, I think that there have been some improvements in statistical capacity, but they have been slow and, in my judgment, inadequate to the task at hand. So I'm quite hopeful that we will, try to see what can be done to really improve much more rapidly the underlying informational systems. Last, on the issue of human rights, how the panel views and approaches these things, I think that there are some things which are just simply foundational to development. You can't really have development which isn't based on some notion of human rights. When we talk about the moral obligation to end or eradicate poverty, it's all based on a concept of human rights. It's all based on a concept of a common humanity. If we're going to talk about, ending poverty, we have to talk about peace. We can't have systematic violence in the world. So there are going to be a whole set of things without which development is, really difficult. And I don't think that the panel will shy away from that. I think it's something that needs to be put on the table, because these are, essentially foundations.
Thank you, Naomi. Thanks. Thank you for your insights and very candid sharing. I just wanted to share 2-3 thoughts. One is a point of departure, and maybe it's coming from my Indian experience, but that's what I hear in all global platforms. You talked of poverty not being static. But if you really look at, say, India, it is the Dalits who continue to be poor. It is the indigenous population, and it is the women across. So I think that lens becomes absolutely fundamental if you're looking at the significant shifts that you talked of. The second, I think, and that's for our conference also, and as a part of civil society, I do think that I at times worry that maybe at the rhetorical level of the speak the UN does, and you're not part of the UN, you've clarified, but what the HLP is doing and what we say seems to merge into each other. I think we need to go beyond that, and let me say what I'm hearing. One of the phrases which your co-chairs, one of the co-chairs, the UK PM has been constantly using, very excited using that, I heard from him a couple of times, the golden threads. I think we're extremely worried about the poison threads. The poison threads of privatization of health, land grab, privatization of water, unjust global trade agreements. So that the poison threads are that worry us, and they are the drivers of poverty, and we don't end up talking about that. We end up having a conversation which is aspirational, but not really about how we are trying to fix the solutions. So human rights, yes, as you said, it's foundational, but I think I also see and hear a very strong cry for justice. And just the notion of justice kind of gets sidelined. So I would say that it's a call for all of us also to now start really pushing the HLP plus the UN system. I like the idea what Paul said, co-construction. It seems that's not completely possible, but I think we need to go back then to our power of people's power, mobilize people, and then connect with the systems. Thank you. It's been fantastic having you here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amitabh, for your closing remarks, and thanks for the interesting discussion to everybody. Before we can go into our well-deserved lunch break, I have just a couple of announcements. One is that we have been reminded several times now that there is a live after the high-level panel, and that will pull the focus on the national level. Now, there are 2 reports as of today available, 2 interim reports on national consultations. One is the Beyond 2015 civil society-led consultations in 30 countries, and the other one is from the UNDG, the national consultations led, I think, in already 83 countries. Both interim reports are available on the World We Want 2015, either now or very soon. And the second is related to the peer learning sessions that are taking place from 3 to 4 p.m. this afternoon. The session in room A has changed topic. It's not anymore on the importance of aging. It's now on disability and aging and how they interlink, and run by Help Age Germany and Handicap. The session in room B on migration and développement is going to be translated from French into English and the other way around. So those who are interested in that topic and speak French can finally use their native language. And the session in room F, Las estrategias para influir en un post-2015 régimen climático, is going to be in Spanish and translated into English, and then the other way around. So room F, who would like to look at strategies to influence a post-2015 environmental framework and speak in Spanish, can do so there. Well, it only leaves to me to wish you a good appetite, enjoy your lunch, and you find your ways to the session rooms after the lunch. Thank you, everybody.